in the discourse. So now today we have people who are going to present in this session. And the first of the presenters is Professor Peter Wasamba. He's from the Department of Literature. I also did a bit of literature, so sometimes I get confused whether I'm history or literature, but now we are in literature. So, Professor Peter Wasamba has been in the Department of Literature for a long time. I can see his publications here, dating back to 2016. He was former Dean of the Faculty of Arts. He has published widely, as I have already noted, and he has also contributed a great deal in the Department of Literature. Today, we are welcoming Professor Peter Wasamba to present make a presentation on literature and human rights, and exploration of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's reflection on the declaration of the state of emergency in his book, Dreams in a Time of War, which was published in 2010. So I have the honor, the privilege really, to introduce a heavyweight among us.
I'm Peter Wasamba, as you've been told, and maybe apologize for saying I belong to the Department of History. I think I belong there because most of my work in oral literature is sometimes called oral history, and I work mostly with historians and not just literary scholars. Anyway, the title seems long and convoluted, but I think in literature we keep on thinking and changing our thinking. So even from the time George asked me at night, what is your topic? And I gave him something before I could go to bed. I have since changed it, but within the same area. And I'm going to present my paper on literature and quest for freedom, a study of Ngugi's depiction of Mau Mau. So it is still the same. And what interests me is that literature, human rights, and Mau Mau rebellion are conjoined in some kind of historical creative context. And I'll break my presentation into 3 sections. 1, the role of literature in society. Then I will look at Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Mau Mau. And in literature, we normally say we'll go look through the text and we'll be debating what Ngugi is suggesting in his creative works, but not just dreams in a time of war, but Ngugi detained, petals of blood, a grain of wheat, trials of Dedan Kimathi, and others that we may learn from as scholars. I will end my presentation today by challenging fellow scholars to rise up to Ngugi's call to all of us to rethink thinking. So literature in Africa has and will always remain literature of commitment, which means that in our creative engagements, in what is happening in society and the contribution that you can make in society. And we know of various writers that have demonstrated this. We must be engaged in the struggle at all times, whether it is physical or through the pen. And most of you remember Christopher Kigbo from Nigeria, a celebrated poet who left lecturing to join the Biafra War and died in war. We all remember Ken Saro-Wiwa of the Ogoniland. We know Frantz Fanon. We know our own Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe, Alex Laguma of South Africa. These are writers who have committed themselves to the struggle for liberation in various times. And Achebe captures this when he says in his text, A Novelist as a Teacher, he says that the role of an artist is to teach society. Because if an artist is anything, he's a human being with heightened sensitivities. He must be aware of the faintest nuances of injustice in human relations. Therefore, an African writer cannot be unaware of or indifferent to the monumental injustices his people suffer. And Achebe further argues that a writer in an African society is a mouthpiece of society. Therefore, he cannot be indifferent to the monumental suffering of his people. And this is similar to what Robert Taylor says, that anywhere in the globe, the writer is a teacher, entertainer, and the looking glass mirror of his society. He not only educates, cautions, or gives pleasure, but also shows society how it works. I argue in this paper that literature is not just a mirror to life. It is the flower of human soul. It strives for the best for humankind and will always support the struggle of goodness over evil. Ngugi wa Thiong'o adds to this debate by arguing that a writer is a social historian. And he says that my writing is really an attempt to understand myself and my situation in society and in history. And the celebrated theorist of post-colonialism, or Edward Said in Orientalism, talks about the gravity of history. And I think that this is what brings all of us together, whether you are in physics, whether you are in chemistry, the gravity of history pulls all of us together, because we must know where we are coming from, and how those events have shaped our interactions with the environment. And I think that in literary scholars coming to talk about or to write about history, we are just responding to Edward Said's dictum of the gravity of history. So let me talk briefly about literature and history. If we go back a bit to comments about relationship between history and society, and literature and society, we'll notice that literature is not at war with history. Indeed, relationship between literature and history is one of complementarity. Friedrich Nietzsche argues that monumental history of a country is not the official accounts popularized by regimes, but the suppressed memory of those living on the margins of existence. And it is the history of those on the margins that literature goes for, because official history is captured by historians, some of whom are hired by the regimes to canonize or well, what the power would want to be taken as the norm. And this brings us to Foucault and his theory of counter-memory, because literature connects with history through counter-memory. And Stuart Hall, Michael Foucault, and George Lipsis celebrate counter-memory as a strategy of democratizing history and creating space for memories suppressed by hegemonic interests. George Lipsis, for instance, argues that counter-memory is a way of remembering and forgetting that starts with the local, the immediate, and the personal. And unlike historical narratives that begins with the totality of human experience and then locates specific actions and events within that totality, counter-memory starts with the particular and builds out towards an entire story. And that is why you will find that as we look at Ngugi's memoir, we focus on
individuals in society, local people, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, and brothers going through Mau Mau experience. For a long time, history has aligned itself with power. It has always been manipulated to justify status quo. However, reality as portrayed through various sites of counter-memory contest this official position through what Charles Taylor calls social imaginary. And Taylor defines social imaginary as the ways in which people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are usually met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. Literature borrows heavily from social imagination to create works of art that are historical in orientation. And this is what Legge calls silent history, because in literature, we go for history in the margins, history that is part of social imaginary, or history that can at best be called silent history, because if it is not brought out through creative works, it might never be captured. And there is a way in which power suppresses history that is coming from the margins. And it is always assumed that when real history is suppressed for a long time, then it dies and people are forced to accept history that the regime deems to be popular. And this is what leads to epistemicide. Because when you are denied the space to know that which you want to know, then it can only lead to epistemicide. And what Ngugi calls us to do is to engage in epistemic resistance. And we shall look at how Ngugi suggests that we do this. And I will not bore you with the story of dreams from the time of war, because you can read it yourself. But this is a memoir of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And interestingly enough, it is just about his childhood. A very short time, because I think it's around 13 or 14 years old when the state of emergency is declared. And this is the time he is going to school. And what is interesting in this memoir is that Ngugi looks at life and observes the suffering under Mau Mau with the innocence of a child's eye. He is a child. He is oblivious of many things, but he witnesses Mau Mau firsthand in their family, because his cousin is shot. His brother, the good Wallace, escapes to the forest. Consequently, his mother is arrested and detained for 3 months and tortured at Kamiridhu to reveal where Wallace disappeared. And their family also break because of the problems that are related to Mau Mau. And Ngugi is brought up by a single mother. But what is interesting in the dreams in a time of war is the dream that in spite of the difficulties of Mau Mau and problems in the family, Ngugi has a dream, and the dream is injected in him by his mother. The mother wanted Ngugi to get an education. And what is interesting in the conversations that Ngugi and his mother has in the evenings after school, the mother would insist on seeing what Ngugi did at school, not to mention that she was illiterate and therefore she could see nothing or read nothing. She could see but not read. So she would ask Ngugi, so what did you get here? And Ngugi would say, I got 8 out of 10. And then she would ask, only that? You could not do better. Try to do better. Then when Ngugi got 10 out of 10, again, she could still ask in ignorance, you could only afford that, as if there was anything left beyond 10 out of 10. But then what we find in Ngugi is the struggle to get an education in the time of emergency. And he's arrested at some point and detained, but he's released because he was truthful. And then the pain comes when he passes his exams and he has to move to Alliance. And he needs a pass to move from Limuru to Alliance. And he's denied a boarding of the train, and he misses the train and he has to come to Alliance on a wagon that is carrying goods. And he arrives in time just to get transport to Alliance. That is the story of Ngugi. But then what we are interested in is what we learn through this memoir of Ngugi. And what Ngugi is commenting about is the land question in the memoir. And it is called, it runs through all his books, and it is theft of land by whites and the African elite, especially those who belong to the church. And this is a strong justification for participation in Mau Mau. Then he raises the question of conflict between customary laws and laws that are introduced by white people, because Ngugi's family lose their land because his father bought land from their neighbor and paid goats, and they agreed orally, the way we agree with our friends and relatives. Then the same landowner went and now got a title and sold the same land with the title deed to the priests, to the churchman. And that man had a title, and the court ruled that the person who had a title was the right owner, because oral agreements and payment in terms of goods was not known to law. And these are some of the grievances that Ngugi points out, and also the conflict between colonial education that deliberately denies Africans knowledge of themselves and their environment and of their past, and education that is liberating, that is promoted by independent churches. And Ngugi has to leave education, the education system run by the church, to join independent school so that he can get knowledge that is liberating. And we notice that Ngugi legitimizes violence in Mau Mau, because according to Ngugi, violence that is redemptive is noble and acceptable. Violence that seeks to free an oppressed people is acceptable, because fighting for life or fighting to defend your rights is a God-given right that should never be relegated. Finally, we notice that Ngugi strives to humanize Mau Mau, as has been said by a number of presenters here, that the narrative that was there before is that these were black forces, the forces of darkness. But from Ngugi's position, these are people who are fighting for genuine grievances. And therefore, as I come to the end, the question is, what does Ngugi want us to appreciate through his writings? All his books touching on Mau Mau. I think that Ngugi is dealing with post-coloniality and struggle for epistemic freedom in his works. And in his seminal book, Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi, who is like a celebrated writer, avers that the lasting effects of colonialism are the major impediments to our final liberation, because we have coloniality that lives long after the end of colonialism. And this exists in structures that are left in place to ensure that Black leaders or the elite rule over us in the same way in which the white people ruled over us. And I think that this is what is done. And as you noticed from the previous presentation, even African leaders and Kenyan leaders are suppressing memory of Mau Mau that might be truthful, because it might interfere with the hegemonic arrangements, because the masqueraders of freedom and liberators might have been the traitors during those days. So we may agree with Quijano that there is a way in which colonialism perpetuates itself in the post-colony through the coloniality of knowledge. And due to colonized mindsets, the formerly colonized enthusiastically delegitimize native perspectives and memory in the post-colony by manipulating official history to favor what Antonio Gramsci calls hegemonic configurations. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o's objective in his writings, especially his memoir, alongside other writers, is to decolonize the African epistemology. Symbolically, Mau Mau war is still raging, not in the forest, but in the psyche of the subaltern. There is a lot of discontent, and you notice it in Kenya's elections. You discover how people are discontented, and sometimes they don't even know what they're discontented about. They're just discontented. And I think that this finds voice in other theoreticians who share the same thinking with Ngugi, like Homi Bhabha on hybridity, ambivalence, and mimicry. And we also have other writers that are other theorists like Spivak, who also writes about the challenges that the subaltern face. And in Kenya, we are in that situation. Mau Mau ended. We celebrated freedom, but here we are complaining about unga every day and other things. And leadership comes, and the first thing they do is to flag relief food. So you wonder, for how many years will African leaders be giving relief food to fellow Africans? And they blamed white people for their poverty. So what is really needed is African approach to thinking. And the African approach to thinking has been advanced by various scholars and using different terms, because others are talking about Afropolitanism as a way of rethinking thinking, to quote Catherine Odora and Howard Richards. They are talking about the need to rethink thinking. What is it that we're not doing right as African scholars and as writers that makes us look so miserable, even when we are independent? And Catherine and Howard argue that the task of rethinking thinking is therefore precisely to recognize the cultural asphyxiation of those numerous others that have been the norm, and work to bring other categories of self-definition: dreaming, acting, loving. It is an act of self-reassertion. And other scholars talk about Africology, especially Dani Wadada and Abudere, that the way to liberate ourselves is to go through Africology, which is African-centered way of thinking. And I think this is also Molefi Asante talks about when he talks about Afrocentricity. And we have Gasheni Sabelo, who is also eloquent in calling on Africans to, first of all, value themselves, think about themselves, and use that as a pedestal to face the world and interpret the world. And I think in Ngugi's way, that is when liberation comes, because liberation from within is the final liberation, and not liberation to create positions for African elite who take it and even steal with abandon. Finally, I can say, as I conclude, so that I don't waste time, because I normally respect time, whatever the term we choose to use, if we are to apply what Ngugi calls for in a dream, dreams in a time of war, is to do what Lewis Gordon calls shifting the geography of reason, bringing it back to the center, to the African area of thought, appreciating African philosophy and African knowledge systems, so that we can be able to shape a new leadership that speaks to us as Africans. And in that way, Mau Mau war will be won. Because in my thinking, and I think that is what Ngugi seems to suggest, because in literature, we have what is called artistic vision and authorial ideology. Ngugi seems to suggest that freedom that is fully liberating cannot come if the mind remains chained, because we will still be left in want. And with that, I thank the leadership of the department led by Kenneth and the team for organizing this wonderful conference. I'm really excited. Thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Professor Wasamba, for that very Thank you very much, Professor Wasamba, for that very captivating presentation. You have told us about the dreams and done a good job of exposition of the main themes that Ngugi explores in that particular memo. You have introduced us to many aspects that are relevant to this conference. You've talked about land conflicts, you've talked about culture, you've talked about the struggle for education, and all of them are in one way or the other connected with the theme of this conference. And so we appreciate that. And we will now call upon another of our presenters to add on to that, to our day's take. And this will be Charles Muiru Ngugi. He is from the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication. His presentation is on the Mau Mau studies towards a new research agenda in social history. Let me tell you something a little bit more about Muiru. And just a minute. Muiru is a senior lecturer in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, University of Nairobi. He has studied in the Kenya Institute of Mass Education in journalism. He has also studied at the University of Wales, Cardiff, where he pursued his MA, and at Erie University, where he studied for and obtained an MA and PhD. He also pursued a PhD in cultural studies at the George Mason University. And he is currently in the board council of the Media Council of Kenya and is the chair of its training and accreditation committee. A former journalist at the Kenya News Agency and Weekly Review. His journalism has appeared in the Daily Nation, Sunday Nation, the East African Standard, Kenya Times, The Option, the Nairobi Law Monthly, Expression. So he's widely known for his works in the various media channels. His academic and research interests are in media, journalism studies, free expression, constitutionalism, nationalism, popular culture, and African studies. I have tried to be brief about who he is. He has a whole length of who he is, but I think I have chosen what is of great interest for us today here, so that we welcome him with an applause to tell us something about today's affairs.
Thank you very much for that very magnanimous introduction. I will, in the interest of time, I will not take a lot of time basically introducing my topic. You have it on your documents there. I'm supposed to speak on Mau Mau studies, the topic of Mau Mau studies towards a research agenda in social history. And what I realized when I embarked on this particular topic, the research of it, or the writing of it, was that the compartmentalization of knowledge wasn't going to serve me a whole lot. So what I ended up doing is setting an agenda for history as a whole, as a discipline, not necessarily, in social history. So you bear with me because of that small little iteration. So perhaps a good place to start would be with this whole concept of Mau Mau studies. Mau Mau, studies is emerging as what you would describe as a discipline, because if there is a corpus, if there is a body of scholars dedicated to the study of a particular field, and if there are departments within universities that are focused primarily in the study of Mau Mau, then we are not very far away from saying that indeed Mau Mau studies is headed towards, if not becoming a discipline, then at least a definitive or specific field or rubric of study. The scholars who study Mau Mau are still all over the place, discipline-wise. There are those in political science, in history, in literature, and indeed there are public intellectuals who are not necessarily, people appended to any one particular discipline. There are even Mau Mau veterans of war who have resolved to take on, the scholars, the gilded historians, like my friend Ken Obongi. And they are actually writing works of history, that will help us eventually to come to terms with this great phenomena. So it is a very or truly interdisciplinary scholarly endeavor that is rich and diverse. What is clear is that all these people, and I'm speaking generally, have tended to focus predominantly on the political history of Mau Mau. And perhaps I think there's a good reason for this. You remember that Mau Mau was a decidedly political project. It's the leaders of Mau Mau, the generals and the political leaders, demanded two things primarily: land and freedom. And they aptly named their army the Kenya Land Freedom Army. Of course, before it was bastardized as Mau Mau by the colonial propagandists who desired to reduce it to some purposeless incoherence. After independence, the political project continued after the colonial ban on Mau Mau was sustained, and the veterans pushed aside, and as former loyalists and collaborators assumed power and pride of place in the new dispensation. It is therefore understandable and inevitable that politics would persist and probably dominate the discourse on Mau Mau. But we all know that the impact and the consequence of Mau Mau was over a very broad spectrum of aspects of Kenyan society, way beyond the military and the security and the political spheres. There has been argument that Mau Mau army had been defeated by the end of 1953, about 2 or so years after the declaration of the state of emergency. And this would suggest that the war was very short-lived. But this only holds true if an assumption is made that the Mau Mau war, both its offensive and counter-offensive efforts, were limited to the military aspects. But as Caroline Elkins has already observed, and I quote, far from coming to an end in 1954, the Mau Mau was just beginning. The forests were no longer the primary venues of conflict. To gain a full understanding of the length and nature of the insurgency, the analysis of Mau Mau must extend beyond the forests into the civilian areas of the struggle, end of quotes. So this is essentially a call for us to expand our excursion into other areas beyond the military and the political aspects and consequences of the war. so that, we are really talking about delving into areas of social history, and not just social history, but also cultural history. The history that speaks to, non-military aspects of the war. And a lot of people, as I've already stated, have already been enjoined in this particular endeavor, but perhaps because the agenda that was set was primarily political, those people have tended to answer those on the other side who are propagating the political discourse around Mau Mau. So that even when we are talking about feminist scholars, and not just feminist scholars, but also, others of personal experiences, who are women, the likes of Muthoni Kimani and Wambui Otieno and others, who have written, sedimentations of works, on this aspect of Mau Mau. They have tended to be motivated by the need to answer those who are addressing this issue from a political perspective. But this is hard enough, Professor Macharia Munene, he presented on Monday, and John Kamau, and also Simon Nyambura and myself realized this when we did research on Mau Mau survivors that resulted in a publication that we launched earlier this year called Kenya's Greatest Generation, Stories of Mau Mau Survivors. And it became evident from the interactions with the survivors that a lot more needed, a lot more was going on during the Mau Mau decade, beside the exchange of bullets and political negotiations. People experience Mau Mau socially and psychologically at very personal, local, regional, and community levels. So hence, what I'm proposing, or my postulation, that a new research agenda is needed to supplement what we already know about Mau Mau. And of course, I was introduced, I'm a journalist, guilty as charged. And, in journalism, we are used to setting the agenda for pretty much everyone. So allow me to be pretentious enough to propose the following research agenda for future research in Mau Mau studies. Number one, we need to begin with stock taking. That is audit of the research that has already been done in the various subfields of Mau Mau history, the politics, the social history, the economic history, of Mau Mau, the religious history of Mau Mau, if that such exists, because that kind of stock taking might just indicate the areas of abundance and saturation, neglect, and want. In other words, what we are looking for is a status report. Where are we? Number two, we really need, to engage in follow-up research, based on, the findings that have come before. I'll give you just one example. John Lonsdale gave us the concept of the Kikuyu moral economy. So the question is, what have we done with it? What is it? Have we been able to link it to the visible and risible social decay now witnessed among the Gikuyu and Kenyans in general? All right. The whole question of corruption. All right. How does it sit with this notion of, Kikuyu moral economy? How can we research this concept further and make valuable connections with the present society? On the question of the dominance of political history, we must also ask ourselves what motivates, this political, history. Which purpose does it serve? Probably even ask, because social history is about, systems, and establishing connections. Whose interest does it serve? by the late 90s, for instance, in the US, Lane Hunt, you might remember, she's the author of a book called New Cultural History, observed that social history has overtaken political history as the most important area of research in history, as evidenced by the quadrupling of American doctoral dissertations in social history, around the 60s and the 70s. So, bear in mind that Kenya has subscribed to liberal democracy as its dominant political ideology. So it follows, therefore, that if the leading liberal democratic state is doing so much research in its own social history, shouldn't Kenya, which is still trying to grapple with the challenge of nation building. As I said earlier, gender, studies around the question of Mau Mau has been attempted and considerable progress has been made. All right, there are memoirs, there are diaries, there are works of fiction. All right, there are scholarly analysis, but I think there are some aspects of it that are left out. I'm here talking about the history of the dalliances and the romance between counterinsurgency policemen and the soldiers and the victim women, all right, or women within the societies that were engaged in the war. The histories of rape and the consequences of it, and other forms of forcible interactions, and the byproduct of such relationships or interactions, as well as survival, and their survival, that is, and the journey of becoming Kenyans. So all that needs to be researched on. I talked about the history of survivors, and we have done a little bit of that, but we have by no means exhausted, the history of the survivors based on our puny efforts that we made recently. Survivors of the war, not veterans of the war. Give me 1 second. Occupy a very interesting nexus. They witnessed the war at a very young age and have a lot to say about that. All right. We know that the war oath, the Mau Mau oath, prohibited their parents from speaking, but we also know that around the family table, all right, and the fireplace, there are always discussions going on. And the young children who are the survivors, many of them were able to get a lot of what was going on accidentally through those accidental eavesdroppings. So children do have a certain vantage point, and that also needs to be explored. Then the trauma, the whole war was a very traumatic period. War touched the entire population of the Mount Kenya region and other Kenyans who participated in the war in various ways as policemen, as civil servants, as religious leaders, all right? So yet there were no counseling services offered to these people during or after the war. So what kind of history can be done around this particular concept? How do people survive such traumatic events? What mental scars does history inflict, and how do they self-heal, the victims, that is, in the absence of professional therapy? That's another agenda right there. Then, how did Mau Mau affect different communities? So it's not just about family history or personal history. It's also about how the impact on different communities based on their level of involvement in the war. The fighting was mostly intense in the Mount Kenya forests around the Aberdare, Nyandarua ranges, but there were people in surrounding areas who were experiencing war. So the question is, were they experiencing this war in the same way? For instance, the people in Machakos, we know that, and Narok, we know that there were Mau Mau fighters and sympathizers in Narok and in Ukambani. But were they experiencing this particular war the same way that the people in Marsabit and Taita and Gabatura and all those places were experiencing this war. So if state formation and national consciousness is a consequence of shared experience, as we have learned from Anderson, Anthony Smith, Hobsbawm, and other scholars of nationalism, how do these differentiations in the war experience affect the project of nation formation in Kenya? And of course, I did note that that is an agenda that is more political than social, but then again, where is the boundary? Professor Macharia Monene recently postulated in a newspaper article that the elections that we have just had was a revolt by the Tomodo. And by Tomodo, Tomodo basically means, small people, and it was a revolt against the presumed Ado, or big people who have taken their the political relevance of the Tomodo and the agency of the Tomodo for granted, right? So the question therefore is, what is the connection between the Tomodo and the Mau Mau adherents? Are the Tomodo the transgenerational remnants of the Mau Mau veterans, survivors, and peasants? Was this past election a play out of the regional class conflicts inherent in this particular war? So what's really is going on? And then of course there is a question of what happened to the Gema culture in the war period. And here the A is for Akamba, because the original postulation of the Gema included the Akamba as part and parcel of that particular grouping. Did war motivate conversion into Christianity in any great way? How did the traditional belief systems, African cosmology, survive the disruptions of the war? So I think because I'm being commanded to stop, I'll just go ahead and stop. But those are some of the ideas that I had, and I thought I would share with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that quite elaborate explanation of your topic. I am glad. I will actually listened very, very, very keenly as you talked about the social history. And I said, well, this is something that we really haven't had. Only I would have liked it better if you had also included education during the Mau Mau, because that is another huge topic that would be very, very enlightening. So thank you very much. So the next speaker will be Miriam Maranga-Msonye. Miriam Maranga-Msonye is from the Department of Literature. She has research interests in narrative studies, focusing on urban realities, children, and refugees. Her presentation today is a literary historical perspective of colonial roles in central Kenya during the Mau Mau period. Reading Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Welcome, Miriam.
Yeah, I was about to say so.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So the next presenter, they are doing it together, is Alina Oswald from Holbrook University. And so she joins Miriam in the presentation on the stated topic. Welcome, Oswald.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. And we'll go right ahead since we have been introduced. And this is how we are going to do it. We'll share. So I'll do a part and then hand over to her like that to show the collaboration. Yes.
All right. Thank you. Let me start this. Good afternoon. As has just been said, we are going to speak about a literary historical perspective of colonial roads in central Kenya during the Mau Mau period. And we do this, as Professor Wazamba just did, with or by reading Ngugi wa Thiong'o. This presentation is part of a larger collaborative project at the intersection of literature and history, thematically focused on African experiences of colonial road infrastructure in central Kenya from the 1940s to the 1970s. This means that the Mau Mau era in the 1950s is just one of the periods we cover in the larger project. So how did we come to this topic? So my PhD project is actually tries to write a history of automobility in 20th century Kenya. And so far, automobility and its road infrastructure have mostly been studied from the 1960s. And if you approach colonial archives, then you will notice that African experiences are largely absent. And while the files can be read against the grain, the general absence of the African voices poses problems. So as has just been said, Dr. Miriam Moraga Musonye is a senior lecturer here, and she's the head of the Department of Literature. And she has worked amongst many things on Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And when we got together, we started discussing an interdisciplinary approach between history and creative literature to see whether we could uncover experiences and memories of road infrastructure. For the purpose of this conference, we today present our findings on that particular Mau Mau era. But we are doing this by using the lens of colonial roads, and neither of us is very well versed in Mau Mau history per se. So we are really inviting your comments and your expertise as this paper today is part of a larger essay we hope to publish. In the wider project, we work with 3 key literary texts in our project, all by Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, namely A Grain of Wheat, Petals of Blood, Dreams in a Time of War. And we posit 3 key questions. How does Ngugi make use of the infrastructure to frame history? Whose memories are conveyed through the narration of colonial roads? And more generally, what can we expect from working at the intersection of literature and history? Today, as we're focusing on a Mau Mau war, we only use A Grain of Wheat and Dreams in a Time of War. In the first part of this presentation, we will discuss interdisciplinary aspects before looking at some of the sources used in the Mau Mau historiography. Next, we provide Ngugi's view on history before we turn to the main part on the Mau Mau period. In the conclusion, we seek to answer the posed questions and evaluate our approach.
Moving on, is my mic on? Yes. All right. Yeah, so the next section of our paper is interdisciplinary aspects and historiographical sources. And we observe that literary and history scholars have for a long time been aware of the relationship between the 2 disciplines, whether in terms of similarities or differences. History aims at recording, documenting, and interpreting experiential realities of the past and relating them to the present and future. Literature, on the other hand, aims at interpreting life and communicating broad truths of life through imagined facts, what we call fictional realities. Creative literature relates to the real world in more than just, help me read that word. Zeitgeist. Yes, but references social relations and intersectional experiences that give interdisciplinary potential. And we refer to Ivan Jablonka, who explains how literature and history relate when he states, and I quote, "Fiction tells us something about society, social groups, social structures, and relations between classes, production, and gender, about social situations, mobilities, and mentalities." So rather than working in disciplinary silos, we can thus heed the renewed and convincing pleas that exist since 1970s for working against the disciplining process and recognizing the discipline's similarities. Most novelists, like historians, are concerned with the conveyance of experiences, but also with the construction of a narrative. As Louis Mink writes, stories are told, not lived. And like creative writers, historians are not simply compiling the gathered evidence, but they use narrative techniques to accommodate their hypotheses and lay out arguments based on evidence in order to represent history. So the disciplines employ, however, different methods in constructing narratives, a factor which necessitates a critical interdisciplinary approach. As one of the few Africanists engaged with the use of literature in history, Jan Vansina cautions against uncritical and extensive use of memoirs in the production of history. And he suggests the need to critically compare them with other sources available, which is what we attempt to do in this paper. The life and worldview of the author can provide background on the creative work, but engaging with it comes with caveats. For example, Roland Barthes argued that literary studies should not be centered on the author, his person, his life, his tastes, and his passions only, a notion shared by other formalist and structuralist theorists. Yet, some Kenyan historians attacked Ngugi wa Thiong'o and called him a bourgeois intellectual in Nairobi, who was unable to speak for the rural oppressed. We recognize that an author's stated circumstances and ideological leanings bear upon creative production, but we also acknowledge that an author's standpoint is earned through critical reflection and observation of everyday life, rather than limited by the author's own characteristics and circumstances. In this paper, we attempt a reverse reading of fictional literature to gain historical understanding by recognizing the fact that creative writers draw from lived experiences to create characters, situations, and narratives which are representative of the regions and historical periods they depict, while having their own worldview and understandings towards history. In the historiography of Kenya, the Mau Mau War was and still remains contentious. And I think we have had this in the days of this conference, the last 2 days. Until the late 1970s, the accounts were often calling the Mau Mau savage, based on selective colonial sources and propaganda material. After that, Maina wa Kenyati broke the academic silence in 1977, having interviewed former Mau Mau fighters for years. Only in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, finally, Mau Mau history was coming to the fore with a series of publications that reevaluated colonial sources, but also worked with oral sources. While questions of nationalism, ethnicity, and social economic roots were in focus, the histories remained androcentric, focused on men. In 2005, Caroline Elkins' monograph integrated a gender perspective in her work on the atrocities in British detention camps based on oral evidence. And it was David Anderson's well-known account of Mau Mau War that also engaged with Ngugi's novels, while he embraced a mix of other sources. And today, in our presentation, we approach the Mau Mau period through the roads infrastructure, as she has mentioned, by engaging with history and creative literature in a systematic way.
And we are now moving on to Ngugi and the nature of history, and this has already been discussed by Professor Wasamba. However, it might be sounding a little bit different when we do it here. In Moving the Center, we learn about Ngugi's representation of everyday history. We can see his anti-colonial agenda presented through his concern with the people's struggle in central Kenya. In his nonfiction monography, Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi then makes the argument that the most fundamental level of language is the language of real life. That is, the relationship people enter into with one another in the labor process of producing wealth or means of livelihood, such as food, clothing, and shelter. He asserts that this process of production is a form of communication and a basic language between human beings. This kind of agential communication between humans is at the heart of creating history and culture, according to him. While in other works, Ngugi has a bold grasp of history, the presentation is rather tentative and a grain of wheat. Nonetheless, all through his oeuvre, Ngugi advocates for decolonization, both in the colony and post-colony. Engaging with post-colonial Marxist thinkers such as Frantz Fanon, Ngugi considers the time after Kenya's independence as a continuing social struggle against imperialism. The easy dichotomy of narrowing colonial experience to white imperialism and black resistance led to the illusion that liberation was achieved at the point of political independence. What was missing was the recognition that class was effective within African societies. Ngugi points here to the intermediaries who acted between Africans and colonial governments, the Nyabara, who were able to consolidate power after independence, furthering imperialist control over Kenya in a renewed form. According to Ngugi, the official history in Kenya might glorify Mau Mau fighters, but it misrepresents them as a mere political liberation movement, silencing its subversive actors and political and socioeconomic demands for access to land, control over food, and cultural freedom. Ngugi advances his views and explicitly presents the role of creative literature and history in the neo-colonial state. Writers and historians, he says, need to clarify the nature and language of the people's struggle in order to further political, economic, and psychological freedom from oppression.
All right, so we move on now to the heart of the matter, and we are looking at colonial roads and the memory of the Mau Mau War. There are at least 3 reasons why the road infrastructure in the Mau Mau period was vital. First, the colonial authorities had wanted and improved roads as infrastructure of domination, exploitation, and war, as critical infrastructure to maintain the lines of communication and to mobilize troops when needed. During the Mau Mau era, the army and home guards used the infrastructure because equipment was transported and Mau Mau fighters and associates were hauled off to jails, courts, and camps through these roads. Secondly, Mau Mau fighters and supporters used this very infrastructure to convey their own fighters, foodstuff, arms, and ammunition. The roads connected and opened up scope for Mau Mau to mobilize and fight. It is not surprising that in certain instances, the forests disconnected from roads provided a better place for the fighters to hide, collect, and regroup. Lastly, roads as a space of socioeconomic interaction produced spectators of war. And this because we find that their bystanders, whether sympathizing with one side or were watching violence unfolding on the roads, just like Ngugi himself, who was a schoolboy at the time. As a key aspect of colonial rule, the roads had the paradoxical role of being both facilitative and oppressive. They enabled desired and critical mobility against the colonial regime, but at the same time facilitated colonial oppression, exploitation, and recruitment during the Second World War. For example, there's a quote in Dreams in a Time of War, where Ngugi says, there was a dirt road that joined Limuru in the Nairobi-Nakuru road, built by the Italian prisoners of war. Some white people used to come there to shoot birds, their dogs thrashing in the water to retrieve fallen game. I had not even crossed the road when at a place we called Kimunya's Corner, I saw a convoy of trucks with men and women caged in the back, an example of how roads were used as infrastructure of war. Another case is also how we see the Mau Mau themselves appropriating the roads and using them for their own agenda. For example, again, there is a recording in Dreams in a Time of War of the death of the colonial chief Warohio, who was assassinated when along the road. And this is how Ngugi records it, that it was from the radio that we learned that senior chief Warohio had been assassinated in what was called a Chicago gang style killing. A car trailing the chief then pulling alongside some people dressed in fake police uniforms, politely asking the chief to identify himself and then pumping him with bullets before swiftly driving away. Historical sources indicate that Chief Warohio Wakongo had been leading the anti-Mau Mau campaign together with his son, David, and he was assassinated on 7th of October, 1952. In A Grain of Wheat, we find a similar account of a roadside assassination, which also dramatizes the use of this colonial infrastructure to subvert the colonial administration. Here, Kehika, a fictional character who was a feared Mau Mau fighter, pretending to be a poor old man, walks along the tarmac road in Rungei district and waylays the formidable colonial chief, the colonial D.O. Robson. When the D.O. approaches his jeep, he beckons to the old man, who then walks to him, knees knocking together in fear. But as soon as the window of the D.O.'s jeep opens, the old man whisks something from his pocket and quickly 2 shots third into his body, killing him instantly, and he disappears back into the forest. Ironically, colonial roads, being open and public, also provided practical ways for the Mau Mau and their supporters to hide in plain sight in order to attack the colonial officials without attracting suspicion. And we have a case of this in Dreams in a Time of War. One of the most enigmatic characters in A Grain of War is Karanja, the collaborator.
Maybe wind up, please. One minute.
All right. Actually, we are heading to the conclusion. So Karanja in the novel is left walking along a road, which we think symbolically means that he, despite having not been nailed down as a traitor, he's still along the road and he has not arrived at a destination, like a man without a home. And so Alina will conclude.
All right. Yeah, sorry, according to our watch, we still have 2 minutes. The fictional novel and the non-fictional memoir generate new insights into the meaning and practices around colonial road infrastructure. The road lens shows variegated experiences of colonialism and nationalism in Kenya. For all we know about Ngugi's thoughts on the role of literature in history, he provides us with much more nuanced experiences than one might have expected. Far from being solely a colonial capitalist tool for exploitation, roads play a dialectical role in the people's struggle. And while our project deals with these big historical moments like the Mau Mau War, Ngugi works out every day in her actions and lets us watch them, how they unfold. Here we see the experiences of loyalists, collaborators, bystanders, even children. However, while Ngugi provides classed experiences, the plots are often told from a male point of view, stressing male initiative, at least in the Mau Mau period. We recognize, to repeat what we initially said, that an author needs to reflect on intersectional dimensions in order to grapple with race, class, and gender. So without asserting that female writers provide gendered perspectives automatically, we think it would be interesting for future research to analyze creative works by women in order to engage with this issue more deeply. And an interdisciplinary approach can generate, we think, novel angles, experiences, and memories that can complement colonial sources, oral sources, and existing historical work, especially in regards to the everyday. Emerging alternative views make space for differing interpretations of experiential reality through fictional reality. It is enriching it by adding nuances, complexities, and possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My teacher once told me, or taught me. Yeah, I'm just remembering, drawing from what they have said, that I was once taught that literature is reality twice removed. I don't know whether it still applies. Those ones in the discipline will tell us more. All that I know is that there is a real symbiotic relationship between literature and history endears itself to many subjects, many disciplines. So now it's my turn to call upon Dr. Alex Wanjara he is a discussant for the first presentation by Professor Wasamba on literature and human rights and exploration of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's reflections on the declaration of the state of emergency in dreams in a time of war. He is also the discussant of the just concluded presentation by Dr. Miriam Maranga and Alina Oswald, a literary historical perspective of colonial roads in central Kenya during the Mau Mau period, reading Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So as Dr. Wanjara approaches, I wish him the best in the presentation, in the discussion, and also maybe you welcome him with an applause.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a great honor to be here with you. I've been told I don't have much time, so let me just dive into the matter. We've been very busy running up and down with the university business, hence my previous absence from these sessions, but I'm encouraged and I'm very happy that with the little I've heard so far, I know that great things are going on. And I congratulate the Department of History for this endeavor. You lead and will definitely follow in the near future. I'm very proud to sit here and discuss presentations by my colleagues from the Literature Department, who I'm sure have convinced you about the intersectionality between literature and other disciplines like history. So I'm not going to spend time trying to belabor the point. I have the arduous task of linking or discussing two presentations. I cannot multitask. I'm not capable of doing that, but I'll try as hard as I can. I got a bit confused when I was told to discuss my professor's presentation here. Then I was told to discuss also my chair's presentation and the wonderful presentation also that was joined in by Alina. But I'm humbled. I'm humbled to be here to discuss your work. Let me start by discussing Professor Wasamba's presentation. He aptly presented the links between literature and history. And he went in to talk about hegemonic history and history from the margins. And he quite deftly brought in a literary text, which is a memoir, Dreams in a Time of War, written by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the most famous writer from this region. He uses this to, point out the suffering that Ngugi, the young Ngugi, went through in his coming of age as a young man at a historical period that happened to be, the time of the Mau Mau War, which is the interest of this conference. Now, I'm not going to repeat our erstwhile professor's words. I'll just try and break down a few things. I think what Ngugi is trying to tell us and what we've learned from Professor Wasamba's presentation is that, thinking of the dialectics of philosophers at that period, philosophers were following Hegelian dialectics and they come into play here. This is the end of a Zeitgeist. Whether or not colonialism happened, this era would have come to an end anyway. And we can see it's very easy to romanticize history and say that Africans were good before they were colonized. That is not true, as Professor Wasamba points to us, because Ngugi's own father was robbed by his own kinsman, his own person, the person who sold them land, and then later on sold that land to somebody else. What does that tell us? It tells us that you know, there'll always be bad people, and these bad people will use new methods, newfangled ways to profit from others. So the fact that there was a new way of dealing with the, you know, transactions, moving from the oral recording of transactions, the morality that Dr. Ngugi has told us, that moral economy, and it has moved to a situation where people have to sign in and say, let's agree that we are selling this land. That does not take away the fact that there would have been con men anyway. And that is what he's trying to tell us is the zeitgeist of that period demonstrates that those same thugs moved from the traditional economy to the modern economy and continue to take advantage of people. But what else do we learn? We learn that Ngugi's mother is prophetic in her vision of that zeitgeist. She tells her son that he needs to get an education because she can see the future. And she knows that education will be the means out of the poverty that they are undergoing as a family, because the father has many wives, many children. But for her, she sees the future in her children through education, something very important. And Ngugi has kept on telling us about this colonial education and its importance in transforming his life. And how does this come about? We can see a practical illustration when Ngugi's father loses all his wealth that was held in terms of livestock, which tells us that the future had to change. This thing had to change. Society had to change. They could no longer continue functioning the way they were. Now, this brings me to another point. I think Professor Samba talked about coloniality of knowledge and how even at the moment, people are dissatisfied, you know, and how we need to have an Africa-centered approach to thinking. Now, I bring all these elements together just to say that Professor Samba is telling us about the decolonial, and Ngugi, in turn, was expressing the decolonial through his writing. What is it that he's telling us? I think Ngugi was a good student of Fanon, Frantz Fanon, because Fanon tells us of the need of violence, and we're told about legitimate and illegitimate violence. The whole colonial enterprise is illegitimate violence, and Fanon tells us that the struggle for liberation in Algeria through war was legitimate violence. But Fanon saw this experience, he saw the whole colonial experience as being traumatic, that the Africans who were colonized and repressed had undergone a form of trauma. And the only way to overcome this was to go back to their colonial past, not going back to the colonial past in an idyllic or romanticized manner, but going back to that state of being prior to colonization, where there were free beings without that psychological harassment. And I think that's what Ngugi is trying to tell us when he takes us through his childhood. And I think it's the same thing that Professor Samba is trying to tell us. Why is it that today we still have disenchantment among the masses? It is because we did not arrive at the form of humanism that was imagined by Fanon in his work. Because all this violence was a form of being in a cauldron. It's like, you know, when people go to get circumcised, they are taken away from their normal society and confined somewhere. They undergo a violence which will now transform them. And now they come back to society as new human beings. So that whole experience of that war, that Mau Mau war, that whole notion that was thought about of violence by Fanon and is being transposed here was supposed to lead to a new form of humanism. And I think Fanon would have been very sad that he lived beyond the 36 years he did, because that new form of humanity is yet to be achieved in today's society. And that's why those same conmen who sold Ngugi's land twice are now our leaders. I think this brings me to the next presentation by Dr. Musonye. and Alina Oswald on roads. Very interesting perspectives, literary perspectives, but they've gone down to a trope. In literature, we call these things tropes. When you find them in a text, commonly used, we say that is a trope. So the trope of the road, very interesting. Now, reading novels like Red Strangers by Elspeth Huxley. Elspeth Huxley is a Kenyan writer, Mzungu, who was widely condemned by people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Michere Mugo. But I've been reading her lately, and I'll be asking, why is it that Elspeth Huxley is condemned so much? Is it that the history she writes about the Gikuyu is uncomfortable? She tells us that the chiefs that came about in the 1920s were actually conmen. They were thugs picked up from the society and found themselves in positions of leadership. And you find that they charged the local community to go and build roads. You know, just like you see in other novels such as Arrow of God by Chinua Achebe in West Africa. These activities were not only limited to Kenya. These things happened all over Africa. But there was a trade whereby those people conscripted to go and give labor in the building of this infrastructure bought themselves out by providing a goat, a cow, and so on and so forth, to those people who had declared themselves the chiefs. And these people ended up being the fathers of those people who sent their sons abroad. They became the chiefs, and their sons who went abroad became our leaders at independence. And now the cycle continues. 100 years later, we've said that we are fighting against dynasties. Now there's a new implantation of self-styled chiefs, starting the cycle again. I think we'll do another 100 years and then start again from the front. So this trope of roads has been there. I would ask that you go back and look at this aspect as it's brought out in other texts by other writers. But I agree. I'm very happy that you bring out again the same things. I won't belabor the point because there's a lot of similarities between the two presentations. So just take what has been stated earlier in my presentations. Yeah, now, again, one last thing. The road, just a question to the presenters, the road and the railway. I like Ngugi's rendition of the railway and the railway station as a place that brings the community together, a place of love, a place of declaration, a place of appreciating technological development. So how would you place the two side by side? And then again, thinking further than Ngugi, the road as a trope in African literature generally. I think of Ben Okri's The Famished Road, whereby the road is a spirit. The road has always been there in Africa, and the road needs sacrifices from people. People need to sacrifice to the road. The road is very hungry. Finally, superstition related to journeying on the road. You know, in Amadou Kourouma's, I was told 5 minutes, so I was taking that. I don't know whether there's a difference. In Amadou Kourouma's memoir on child soldiers, Allah is not obliged, they bring in these superstitions again. I don't know why we call them superstitions. Historians would like to say that these are African beliefs, that if I'm to go on a journey on a road and then I trip, I have to cancel that journey because my African culture tells me that your journey is going to be cast. So there's that spiritual aspect of the road as part and parcel of the spirit world in African culture. And that is something probably we'd like to think about and probably relate to Ngugi, even though his work is based on steeped in realism and does not really delve into surrealism or the supernatural. Thank you very much for giving me this chance.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wanjara. So now we are actually time bad. So I'll call upon George Odenye. He is a discussant for the paper, the presentation by Moiru Ngugi. So George, you're around. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm George Odenye from the Department of History and Archaeology. And I don't want to start another presentation on the presentation that Ngugi made. So I'm going to be very brief. Now, from what I managed to gather from Ngugi's presentation is that Ngugi is encouraging the adoption of a new methodology in reconstructing the past, that's adopting a multidisciplinary approach in trying to interpret the past. He's also saying that we should move away from writing the history, the political history or the military history, and focus on the history of the people. And he takes Mau Mau War as a case study. From what I gathered again from Ngugi's presentation is that any historical phenomenon like that of the Mau Mau had a far-reaching impact. It did not only impact on the political leaders or the military leaders, but it also had an impact on the people. So why can't we adopt a methodology that will make us study the impact of any historical phenomenon on the people, not the military leaders or the political leaders? In fact, that is what Harvey said in 1912 about the new history, that we should move away from the military and the political history to the history of the people themselves. And that brings me to a question, and I want to ask Ngugi about this. Could it be that there was more focus on the political and the military aspect of the Mau Mau that led to the more controversies in the interpretation of the Mau Mau that we had in the 1980s and the 1970s? Will we also experience the same controversy when we write about the history of the people, not the history now, not focusing on the political or the military leaders? And the chair allowed me to say this. I'm going to leave this conference a confused person. And I don't think it is the intention of this seminar to confuse any participant. Can the historians in this room, Dr. Gona, Dr. Mbongi, and any other historian physically present and those online, help me in understanding this? It is widely accepted by historians that history is a science. A science in the sense that if a group of historians are given the same evidence to interpret, then they will arrive at the same conclusion. Now, in 1975 or thereabout, William Ochieng and Bethel Ogot, in a bid to understand the nature of the Mau Mau, went to the field and collected the data about the Mau Mau war songs. And by studying the Mau Mau war songs, they found out that the songs only expressed Kikuyu values. So they came to a conclusion that Mau Mau was a Kikuyu tribal affair. Now, if the likes of Professor Simeo, the likes of Mwaniki, the likes of Professor Mwanzi are given the same evidence, will they also come to the same conclusion that Mau Mau was a tribal affair? Please help me understand that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, George, for that kind of summary of what we have been going through. We have now come to the question and answer session. So I'll take some questions. This one here.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Mweni Muli, and I want to thank this, let me just thank this department for this conference. I teach sociology, and one of my students asked me when I was teaching a course called Social Structures of East African Societies, why is it only the Kikuyu who are emphasized in the Mau Mau War? And I think from this conference, I got the answer. So when I teach it next time, maybe I'll have the answer. And my question is directed to Professor Wasamba. He's not here.
No, Alex, the answer.
Alex, okay. Can you be Professor Wasamba then? Now, how far do you think Google would agree to the notion that Mau Mau led to political freedom? That is, we are the independence. But the colonialists reinvented themselves and continue to rule Kenya even more viciously.
More here.
Thank you. My question is to Professor Wasamba and his representative. Professor Wasamba talked at length, or mentioned it anyway, at length, the issue of an African approach to thinking and like Africa-centered. But my question is there really a thing like African? Because we hear this so often. Do we really stop to think of what we are really talking about? What is African as such? Am I African? I'm third generation Kenyan. I'm granddaughter of G1G. Some would say, yes, I am. And some would say, no, I'm not, because I'm not Black. So is African racial or is it geographic? Do we really consider the North Africans African the way we talk about African in sub-Saharan Africa? I think we have difficulty there in really identifying with them in those terms. Yeah, so I think I made the point that what is African? And the things like African socialism, African feminism, I would like to say there's no such thing. What today we are greatly missing, I think, in the way we analyze our societies, if we are refusing to look at the class issue. So there are the have-nots and the haves, and that's the big difference. It's not a question of whether you're African or not, or all Africans are the same. They are not. Okay? So it's about 100 years since the October Revolution, and the whole issue of class was brought forward then. We have resisted it and resisted it. Are we going to continue to resist getting a scientific explanation of how our societies function? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will get another one from the online participants. Online participants, there's anybody who would like to?
Hey, yes, hello.
It's none.
Hello,
So,
hello.
Dr. Wanjara, your turn to respond.
Can you hear me? Yeah, this is what is called being thrown under the bus. You know, I've been left to answer very difficult questions, but I'll try as best as I can. I think the first question was about whether political freedom came with independence, if I understood you well, and how Ngugi would have seen that, right? If you look at Ngugi's corpus of works, it is obvious that he did not see that liberation that he was seeking in the, aftermath of independence. There's what is called the post-colonial condition that was being discussed by authors from the 1970s that expressed a continued disenchantment with the status quo, in that the only thing that had changed was the color of the skin of those in power. But other things such as, oppression politically, economically, and socially continued, sometimes even in worse ways than in colonial times. And this is evident in Ngugi's works, such as Petals of Blood, when he thought and asked himself, it took a lot of time between his trilogy and publishing Petals of Blood in 1977, because he kept on asking, how do I write a socialist novel? And even when you see his Kamiridu project, which if it was allowed to move to its end without him being thrown into detention, would have been the most revolutionary act or action in this part of the world, because it was educating the masses about their plight and how to express it before now you react, bringing the Marxist theory to praxis. And again, the question of understanding the subaltern and allowing the subaltern agency. So Ngugi did not feel that freedom had been achieved, and his whole life's work was to act against that. It comes through very clearly in his texts. I hope that is what Professor Wasamba would have said. On the question of being African, I think Africa is just a tag, the word Africa. Where do we find that word? What's the historical origin of that word? Maybe the historians here will tell us. But human nature is dynamic. We don't have to put tags and say because of this person's skin color, we cannot call them African. We are trying to move humanism beyond that racial approach to things. So yes, you are African, you are Kenyan, that's the history, that's the fact, that as it is now at this point in time, on this day in 2022, all the people who identify as Africans should be allowed that, just that. Other things, if you go beyond that, I think you'll be, being either racist or xenophobic. So history has changed. We talk about Afropolitanism, Afrocentrism, and we want to use this as an academic way to come together and find a way forward. This cannot be done away with we have to learn to work in that manner. And I also hope that goes some way into answering your question, although I do not know whether that is what Professor Wasamba would have said. It's just thinking of a new humanity, as Fanon would have liked, beyond race and class interest.
I have just been forced to stand because our lunch is getting cold and we are getting hungry. But Mariam and Alina, do you have any quick comment to make about the issues that were raised so that we don't, please. Now this is culture. It doesn't allow me to give you something with my left hand. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just stand here and say quickly about Ngugi and his, just quickly to the question that you asked. I think you asked something about Mau Mau. What I observe about Ngugi's over, from the beginning in his earlier works, he was quite ambivalent about the role of Mau Mau in the freedom struggle. For example, a work like A Grain of Wheat, which we referred to, it's very ambivalent. He is not out and out celebrating Mau Mau. So with characters like Kihika, whom we mentioned in our paper, who is a freedom fighter of renown, of course, he's fictional character, but the way he develops and the way he dies in a way that questions are asked by characters, that is death like that freedom? Is that freedom really? That kind of violent death? And there isn't a celebration of violence, the way Professor Wasamba talks about it in that novel. But later on, in later works, the children's stories, like the Jambanene stories, where there's a child protagonist who joins the Mau Mau at a very early age. This is a later work. There is a clear celebration of Mau Mau as a freedom movement. In Matigari, another novel, again, we see he becomes very clear about his position, and the Fanonian approach to the celebration of violence is now quite clear. So I think that is what I would say. And to Zarina's question, I think being African is almost more like, what can I say? It's a state of mind and ideological. So it's not, I don't think it's necessarily geographical. I think it is even more historical than geographical, in the sense that, like, you have challenged us about, you know, some of the people we have in this country, where do we classify them? And I'm saying, we can't say you're not African, because the experience, it's about the experience, about worldview and so on. So I think many people are African, regardless of skin color. Yes.
All right. Alina, a quick one. 1 second.
Oh God, now I'm between lunch and.
Yes.
I just want to quickly react to the comment on infrastructure and how it was built. We didn't focus on that because it is not the theme of the conference, but this is something we are doing, and how roads were built and how they were used. And this is also a very important comment, of course, ties together then with what we thought about in the post-colony as well, and after independence, and who these people were who worked and who got out of working. That is just one comment. And I think in our other longer paper, we also have the experience of Central Kenyans with white prisoners of war, Italians breaking stones and building the roads manually, and that also kind of leading to the understanding that, you know, white people are probably like us, and people returning from the war and having seen white people die. So all of these things, of course, lead up, but we didn't focus on them today.
Thank you very much. Alex, you treated the question of identity that Zarina raised. Is a question historians have grappled with for years, but we have not exactly come to an agreement, because if even the origins and development of the label Africa is actually not ours. Is Latin, means a warm place, given to this region by the Romans, because Afrique was the southernmost part of the Roman Empire, and that is where we got our name from. Mazrui, Professor Ari Mazrui grappled with this issue of identity for years. And in the Tribal Heritage, he suggests, using his own example, that he is African by soil, Arab by blood. I didn't quite agree with that, but it's very, very interesting. But the idea is that, pure identity is actually not part of the greatest strength of the African continent. The continent has had interactions with other parts of the world, and you see the results of that. Even when you come to those of us who are called Africans, is there a pure Kisii, for example? If you took me as an example here, no, you find that we are all hybrid. I'm a mixture of so many things, including one that is much more recent, that I have a Luo ancestry, so am I pure? The answer is no. What we learn from historians of migration and settlement is that all the African communities are hybrid. In fact, Professor Gott went even to calculate what percentage of those who call themselves Luo are Luos. He found hardly that 5%. So if you find yourself here and you have made a contribution here, my belief is that you are African. That is my belief. Thank you very much. Now we want to go for lunch, and we have only 30 minutes to take our lunch. Our lunch is served where it was yesterday, and we want to be back here exactly by 2. We are running late. Please. Some we can go through here, others we can go through the back, and in a